What's up, Audioholics? We are back another Thursday night. We have Dr. Sean Oliver Harmon. How you doing, Sean?
I'm good, thanks.
Good to have you back. And we got Matthew Pose, our own Matthew Pose. And I wanted to focus on the topic of listening tests. And in the title, I said that
Matthew Pose, our own Matthew Pose.
I don't know where that feedback's
I wanted to.
Is that you, Sean?
Sorry.
There
you're streaming through my laptop.
Uh-oh. So I wanted to focus on listening tests and talk about the dishonesty of cited tests, because for years, when people set up listening tests, whether it's at a dealer or if it's online, usually it's not blind, it's cited. And you guys have done decades of research showing how people are biased by what they see or what they perceive based on if something looks better or if it's a prestigious brand. I know you've made analogies to, wine tasting and other kinds of things like that. I wanted to talk to you about the biases of cited tests and how these biases can be minimized by taking away the visuals and trying to do more controlled listening tests, because evidently it changes the outcomes of those listening tests in many cases.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. We do all of our tests blind, and I'll talk about this in a second, but I had to prove. I showed up at Harman in 1993, and they weren't doing blind tests, so I had to prove internally that we need to do them, that people are actually biased. So I actually had to do an experiment, and it was interesting because when I arrived, I was not a popular person. It was like the auditor from the IRS showing up at the Trump Corporation to do tax audits. I mean, people were, I don't need to be, my speakers don't need to be tested. They're the best sounding they can be. So it was like they were under the microscope or being tested. So it took a test like this to actually show there's a need, that we need to do this. And even expert people, even engineers are biased, which is reassuring because it means they're human.
Yeah, and I've always been of the mindset where if there's a big difference in stimulus between speaker A and speaker B, then there's no way the visuals can really pollute the results of that. I always thought cited or blind tests are more necessary when you're dealing with minute differences like an amplifier or a cable or something like that. But evidently you have data that shows otherwise.
Yeah, it's particularly it's a complex question because back at the NRC days, I for a while I was building crossovers for companies, and it was always difficult to judge them because you want them to sound good, but you're aware that it's biased, and you're aware of the frequency response measurements because you've been measuring the speaker and tuning the crossover. So I find it actually less stressful to be able to do the test blind because I'm not dealing with these issues.
Right. The other thing I wanted to go over when you do the presentation is what's a double blind test? What's a single blind test? Because I think a lot of people in any industry abuse the term double blind, and they're not really truly running double blind. At best, they're running a blind test. And at the worst, they're running a blind test with familiarity bias because the people that are in the test know what speaker is behind the curtain. And if there's a certain speaker that has a certain coloration of sound, then they know they could gravitate towards that. If their company makes a speaker that has a coloration, whether it's a horn or something, they'll pick that speaker because they want to keep their job, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean...
Yeah, the best example I have of that was when I worked at NRC, and we had all the Canadian manufacturers come in and use our listening room, and there was this guy named George Baker from API, which made Energy, Mirage, and he was in sales and marketing, and he would his whole goal was to come into the room, identify the Energy 22, which was frequently in the tests. It was a really good speaker in those days. And he would, as soon as he identified it, he would give it 10, 10, 10, 10. And he would walk out of the room and said, I nailed it. And that was like his day. So he recognized that speaker. He'd heard it so many times. Yeah. And it was very clear he was biased. But it was a bit of a game for him to pick out the Energy 22.
Yeah, definitely. I could see that. All right, so I'm going to share. If you share your screen, I'll bring up the presentation. And guys, we're probably not going to have time to go over every slide because Sean has like 50, but it's on our Patreon channel at patreon.com/audioholics. If you remember, I already put the links up there, and there's a PowerPoint there, or it's actually a PDF you could download, and you can go over this live presentation at your own leisure.
I don't know, Gene. I say we just go to 2 a.m.
I got to measure a Yamaha receiver tonight, man. I got to put it, I've been delaying this thing for too long. All right, here we go.
All right, can you see it?
Yep, you are live.
Okay, so yeah, so we may not cover all this, but so let's start off with this definition of what I think is a single blind, a double blind, and a triple blind. And it's really quite easy. Single blind is when the listener or the subject's not aware of the treatments or products being tested. And I kind of extend this to also there's no external clues. So it's not just the products, but if they can identify the products based on the location, they never move. If there's relative loudness differences, switching contacts. For a while, I had a ABX switcher where the relays had different sounds depending on whether you clicked A, B, or X, and you could guess the correct answer, which was X, is A, B, or X. You could basically hear based on the sound or the resonance of the relays. There were big mechanical relays, so that was something we had to fix. Clamping forces. So we started doing headphone tests, and people could identify the headphones based on the weight, the clamping force. And if you have a hum or a buzz in one of the channels, that's a clue. And the next the next level of blindness is double blind, and that's when the subject and the researcher are unaware of the products being tested. If the test is blind and there's a computer controlling the test and randomly selecting the products, then there's an argument to be made that maybe the test administrator can control the switching. But even then, it's better if the subject controls the switching, because the test administrator may start inserting their bias on the test by not switching to the bad speaker and switching between the two good ones. And I found myself doing this when we have group tests, and you can't give the switcher to one person because there's multiple people.
Question for you on the double blind. When you administer a double blind test, do you analyze the data knowing what speakers were in that test, or do you actually analyze not knowing what speaker A, B, C, or D was, and you don't find out until until you crunch all the numbers?
So, usually when I had people running these tests, sometimes we'd have a group of products that we'd have to test, and I wouldn't know how they were set up, or maybe what one of the competitors was. So I always liked that, because I could go in and do the test and not be aware of what were the competitors. But generally speaking, when we get to the analysis, I'll know what products were in the test. And that gets to this third blindness, which is when the people analyzing the data don't know what the products are. And I could make this triple blind if the data were just simply coded in a way that it was speaker 1, 2, 3, listener XYZ, which is generally you should be doing, because you want to have respect privacy of listeners and not have their names in the actual results. So this can be achieved by coding the data, or you could always just give the data to a third party. But even the third party shouldn't be aware of what the products are and what their identities are.
Right.
So yeah, we do at Harman. We do single blind for sure. We do double blind, yes, but we don't always do triple blind, which we could fix.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not going to talk. I've talked about this before, but I'm not going to talk about it now. You can look at it. And these are all, besides being blind test, to do a really good test, you have to control all these factors. So over on the left, sighted biases, those are eliminated by a curtain. But then there's the hearing and the training and the expectations, group interactions, and on the right you have all these acoustic things that you have to control: relative levels, locations, tracking the music program, and so on. So,
do you typically train the listeners before they sit down and do these tests? Because I know you had that software, we talked about it last week with the headphones. Do you put them through the training so they know what to listen for?
Yeah, we use the software. They have to get to level 8, so they have to be able to identify 8 resonances based on frequency and peaks and dips and different types of filters and so on. So yeah, they have to meet a minimum level of training using this software before they're. Of course, they have to pass a hearing test, so we don't have any people from JBL Pro that participate.
When you do the hearing test, is it a typical hearing test that you go to an ENT that limits to 8 kilohertz, or do you go beyond that?
It is, but there are available now high frequency audiometers that go up to 16 or 20K, and I'm working in a project right now where we have one of these. So it is possible to go higher, but unfortunately, most of the standard ones they're just interested in speech bandwidth. So anyways, we do tests, double blind tests in car audio. Well, sometimes we do.
How do you do that with a car? How do you do that?
That's right. If we use binaural methods, it's blind. If the person actually sits in the car, we try to make it as blind as possible by hiding speaker logos and we train people so that hopefully they're less sensitive to these kinds of biases. Speakers, of course, they're easy to make blind by putting a curtain. Headphones, we have a method for doing those, and it's relatively easy for speakers and amplifiers, room algorithms like room correction, up mixers, so on. Those are easy. Any kind of electronic component is pretty easy to do a blind test. Just to point out that doing these kinds of tests are expensive and challenging, and they take time. And most audio companies don't do these tests. And in the audio review business, this 99% of probably the reviews you read are not double blind, they're not single blind. Usually the audio reviewer has full knowledge of what they're reviewing and how much it costs and so on. And this is okay, I think, because you get feedback on the fit and the feel and a lot of practical things that we don't deal with in these tests. But and if you have meaningful measurements like what you provide, comprehensive measurements on and off axis, then I think that's kind of a truth check, which basically guards against these crazy reviews that don't seem to correlate with measurements.
Yeah, and the other thing that you probably don't consider, a lot of companies don't want reviewers to do comparisons. They want a dedicated review, but they don't want their product compared to another product, because if you have 10 products in a comparison, the only winners are number 1 and number 2, right? Everybody else is tied for last place.
Yeah, that's a good point. You want the review to be all about your product, and you don't want any references to other. But in the headphone, it's not common, but I see more and more, particularly in headphone YouTube channels, where they will often compare a headphone with 2 or 3 other known references, and usually that's not a problem if your headphones really measures well and sounds good. But I'm sure certain manufacturers aren't happy about that.
Speaking of a known reference or a control, do you guys employ a control, like a known entity, into the test all of the time? or is it random sometimes that you put that good speaker in so you know that the test is still valid?
It's very rare that we can only, the speaker mover only accommodates 4 single or 4 pairs. So typically, if it's a new product, you select 3 competitors, and that's, there's no space or room for anchors. Of course, you can, and sometimes the test it's a revision of an old product, so you'll include the old one. Sometimes with Revel, we'll compare a new one with some of their other products. Of course, when you're comparing a $20,000 speaker, it's expensive to have a lot of competitors. So
yeah. So you ever do the blind test with different brands within your own company? Like, I'm always wondering how the JBL M2 would compare against the Salon M2. Completely different speaker, but they're at the top of the food chain in both brands.
Yeah, we have done that comparison informally, and just out of curiosity. I went back and forth myself whether to get the M2 or the Revel Salon, and
yeah, I guess the Salon won. Guys, I see him behind you.
Well, yeah, it did, but a lot of it was practicality. I didn't want big amps, big crown amps with fans in them, and it was
right. Bigger baffle, and it's a wider speaker. It doesn't fit in a room decor as well as the Revel.
Yeah, I'm a sort of a pseudo single guy, so I don't have someone complaining about the looks of it. But I care enough about the looks myself that I ended up going with the Salons.
Right.
But either choice is not wrong.
Yeah, I got you.
So yeah, just to give an example of, we've looked at correlations between our tests, which are based on blind listening, and some consumer report. And these are headphones that where they gave sound quality ratings, so we could directly compare our, in this case, predicted ratings using our model to headphones. And the correlations are, on average about 0.5, not large. Interestingly, Consumer Reports had the highest correlation.
Wow, because they used to have the lowest, right?
Yeah, with back before we did research on this topic, they had negative correlation with our speaker ratings. So I was talking about this last night. When you read Consumer Reports, you would have to turn the magazine upside down to see the true sound quality of the products. But it seems with I think these are over-ear headphones, but I need to check. But yeah, so that's interesting. Ratings, which is Artings, which is totally based on measurements. I would have suspected they'd be higher than 0.55. But
yeah, that is interesting. What's the sample size?
38 headphones. So
yeah, okay.
The numbers below show the samples that we used to calculate this. And I don't know if this was before they changed their reference curve. So apparently they're now using a Harman target for headphones. But they're using a head acoustics test fixture, which is different than what we use. And they claim they've accommodated or compensated for that. But that's something. And I'm not sure how they calculate this number. It's a bit of a mystery. So how they calculate their sound quality rating. So
right. Yeah, I never really understood that either.
It's a weighted, if I understand correctly, it's a weighted score based on the measurements that they come up with relative. So it's like a variance from the reference. So you've got your Harman curve, but their modified version of the Harman curve. They've got what they measured. There's the difference between those, the standard deviation from it. They then calculate some sort of weighted score based on that for each of the categories. Then those are weighted and added together to get final scores.
Yeah. So do they just include frequency response, or do they include some of the other measurements?
I thought more was included than just frequency response, but I could be wrong.
Yeah. Anyways, I think it's worth looking into it more recently, because they may have changed. But CNET and PC Magazine is really quite low.
So PC Magazine should not be our source for.
No, that's the last place I would go for insight on what sounds good.
It's funny about Consumer Reports, because years ago I always thought their car reviews were garbage, and then they got better. Like I start finding myself agreeing with their assessments of cars. So maybe they just tightened up what they're doing in their whole process or something.
Yeah. Who does the car reviews? Do you know?
I don't know, but they don't just do. The thing I like about Consumer Reports car reviews is it's not just about performance. Like you go to Motor Trend or Car and Driver, it's all about the track, right? But Consumer Reports does the comfort, the reliability. You know, I mean, it's just much more practical for the everyday driver, not for someone that's putting a car on a track.
Yeah. I mean, it's very rare that car reviews even mention the audio system. So to get any feedback on the audio is they're way ahead of anyone else.
True, yeah.
Quite frankly, Gene, I think we need to start test driving some cars in order to do some car audio reviews.
Yeah.
You know what? Harman has a lot of audio products in cars, so Harman should be sending us cars to review. You know, hopefully if there's in a Corvette, I'll take it for a few months, and I'll let you guys know how the system is.
Yeah. Well, you can get Harman sound in a Ferrari.
Well, I'll take that too. I'm not that picky.
we had Ferraris a few years ago in our test lab, and someone was did a story, and I got to pose leaning on a Ferrari. I think it was a California. And I posted the picture on Facebook, and all these girls that I grew up with in high school suddenly reappeared on my. So I think there's some truth. If you have a Ferrari, it can attract the
wrong kind of girl.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I who's the guy that runs your car division for audio? Is it Greg something, if I remember correctly?
Well, one of the guys is Greg Sidoric. He's based in Europe, and I think he's the director of system engineering in Europe. Yeah. Yeah,
it was interesting because I had my other BMW, the 2 Series. It had the Harman system, which was good, but then I listened to the Harman system in the M4, and it was way better. And I was like, "What the hell's going on here?" Right? And it turned out it wasn't the Harman problem. It was BMW cut the budget on the 2 Series. They took Logic 7 out, and all they did was put left plus right into the center channel. And anytime you couldn't turn it off, you couldn't change the volume, so it just collapsed the stereo sound stage. Everything was right into the center on a 2 Series BMW.
I'm sorry.
Well, I took it out and did my own aftermarket system, and I got rid of the center channel, so I'm a lot happier now.
Yeah. So then we just looked at the correlation between price and the rating, and you can see the correlations are much higher than what we found. We found very low correlation between price and sound quality for around ear headphones, 0.23, but some of these correlations are much higher. So you wonder whether this is coincidence or is this a real bias where price is influencing their reviews.
So sound and vision apparently is quite influenced by the price of products and the quality of the reviews, but PC Magazine is just all over the place.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think their ratings are just pretty random, so they're not influenced by price very much.
So how do
performance?
Or performance.
How do these correlations change with respect to loudspeakers? Is it similar? Or is headphones? Because I always thought there's more snake oil in speakers than there are in headphones. Or I could be wrong because I don't spend a whole lot of time looking at super expensive headphones.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever done a similar kind of comparison with speakers. I have an example later on the slide deck where we have some speakers that were highly rated in reviews, Speaker of the Year, and yet when the reviewers came in and did the test blind, their opinions changed. So
wow.
So I think price is a pretty good predictor of how speakers will be scored in some magazines.
Mm-hmm.
So I mentioned this when I joined Harman. I was in '93. I ran into a lot of friction, pushback, and one of the common things was speaker engineers said they were immune. They were immune to bias. I'm a professional, and I'm not influenced by price. You know, even to the point where the products they worked on, they said they weren't biased. So anyways, I had to do these tests to basically save my job. So maybe I was biased because I was strongly motivated to come up with a positive result, or an effect. But we did some tests blind, and then we came in a few days later, and over the course of a week and a half, did the test cited. And these were all employees. Some of them were engineers. Some of them were just in marketing or sales. And I don't know if we've ever shown what the products were. I think this is the first time. But in all the publications, they're labeled as D, G, S, and T. And D was a JBL 5000 Ti.
I remember those speakers from like the early 90s or late 80s.
Yeah. Well, this was done in 93. So
yeah.
But they were big, expensive. And at this time within Harman, there was this, we had two different versions of the same product, identical drivers, but D was voiced for Danish, Northern European preferences, and G was the same speaker with a more expensive crossover voice for German tastes. So within Harman, there was, someone had convinced a high-level person that Germans and Danes have different hearing and different tastes.
It's similar to the East Coast, West Coast sound that was prevalent in the United States that I remember reading about decades ago. Do you remember that as well?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there is this myth that there's East and Coast West sound, and I don't know if it's true or if it's just different philosophies in how to design the speaker and how to measure it. I know East Coast sound has had this sound power philosophy where the sound power is all that matters, and it was followed by Consumer Union, Consumer Reports, Bose, AR, and they really paid a lot of attention on sound power. And I think in the West Coast it might have been more direct and early reflective sound, but I could be wrong.
They have good vibrations there.
Yeah, good vibration.
Yeah.
I mean, Floyd Toole would know this because the other day I asked him, when you first published your research in the 80s, did you get a lot of pushback? And he said, oh, yeah. And the biggest pushback was from East Coast companies who he, said, Toole, do you actually have telephones in Canada? How can you do this research? And they were very... not very respectful, and said, it's the sound power that matters. And then in Britain, a lot of the speakers only focused on the direct sound in the listening window. So there was this dichotomy of opinion on what mattered that was geographically based.
Interesting.
Yeah. So S was this new product we came out with called Sound Effects, and it was our first attempt to do a sort of a home theater modular system. Home theater in a box, and there was the music one was just a single tweeter little woofer with a powered subwoofer. I'm pretty sure we included the subwoofer in the test, but it was built out of plastic, and it was obviously quite small and didn't look very impressive when you saw it in a sighted test. And then we had a competitor, which was at that time highly praised in various audio magazines, and it was of similar size to the TI 5000s, and also very expensive.
They're supposed to be time coherent first order crossovers. That was what Teal did.
Yeah, I've never understood first order crossovers. They just basically limit the power handling of the transducer. And
no, Sean, they have better resolution.
Yeah. Okay, so the test was done blind, and this was back before we had speaker movers. So you set the four speakers up in a room, and you had to repeat the test. This was a symmetrical room, rectangular room, and you could get away with testing each speaker in an inside position or an outside position because the effects were the room interactions were more or less symmetrical. So you would get similar results in location 1, where speaker A is, as you would with speaker C. So we had to repeat the test. We always had to repeat the test to control for positional effects.
Again, this is mono testing, right? This isn't
Yeah.
two speakers in stereo.
Right.
Do you talk about that in this presentation? Why you guys went with mono instead of stereo?
It was based on the work that Floyd had done, where he showed that people are more discriminating when they hear a single source, and the results tend to track in stereo, but there's just more noise in the data.
Mm-hmm.
And we've since done more tests where we showed it in mono, stereo, and 5.1, and the differences in the speaker ratings start to collapse as you go from one source to 5 sources. So it's interesting that the more sources you add, things start to sound better, or you're less. So the world's worst speaker might sound okay in 32 channels of playback.
Yeah, I noticed that with room correction. If you set up room correction, it can actually sound good with all the speakers playing. But then if you go and just listen to 2 channel, then you can determine whether that room correction actually is beneficial or not. And usually when I hear 2 channel with like Odyssey or just one of the room correction systems, I wind up turning it off.
Yeah.
But it sounds okay when you had 11 speakers playing.
Yeah, I was talking about this last night on Aaron's Corner, and I was at work the other day listening to up mixers, and I was able to solo or mute different channels. And when I just listened to the center channel, the differences were enormous between these up mixers. You could hear.
Well, that also depends on if you have center spread turned on or off on Dolby, because turning center spread on really mutes the center channel, because with it off, it takes all of the left right info and kind of dumps it to the center, and it sucks when you listen to 2 channel music without that feature.
Yeah, so it's very clear being able to listen to one source or one speaker. You can hear a lot more artifacts than when you're listening to all 7.4, 7.1.4. So yeah, so in the sighted test, obviously we removed the screen, and they could see the speakers. They were in full view. And so here's basically the summary of all the tests. In the sighted tests, the speakers were people used the lower part of the rating scale. The differences were much smaller. When you can see the speakers, the big JBLs, the scores go way up. The home theater in a box goes down, and the teal is more or less the same. So clearly, when you can see big, expensive products, I don't know how much having a JBL logo biased these people, because they're all JBL employees. I'm sure it was a factor, but it didn't bias them when they saw the JBL sound effects, which they said, well, that's just a small, cheap product. They can't.
Did they know it was a JBL though?
Yeah. I think most people knew, could identify it. It wasn't something that was secret at that point.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting that this cheap JBL home theater in a box like product sounded better apparently than the teal.
Yeah, well, that happens. I mean, we have
poor teal.
Well, they're gone now.
Well, yes. Maybe that's why.
It's not cool to talk about a company when they're gone, but who knows? Maybe this was foreshadowing. I don't know.
I forgot which JBL was the German and which one was the Danish. Is it D?
What?
D. Oh yeah.
Yeah, G is German, D is Danish.
So this expensive upgraded crossover that the Germans got didn't appear to make much difference in the preferences.
No, that's right. And we had German listeners come in and do the test, and they were pretty well indistinguishable. I mean, statistically, they're basically a tie, and so that was interesting. That was our first real hard data showing that spending a lot of money for two SKUs of the same product based on alleged cultural taste was there wasn't a lot of fact-based evidence behind it.
Well, one question I have for you is, were the parts tolerances the same? Because if you're only testing a mono speaker, if one crossover had better parts tolerance, then when you put it in stereo, you would probably get better stereo imaging between a pair than the one that used poor quality
Yeah.
tolerance in their parts.
I think the main difference was the D had a slightly different crossover. I mean, I'll show you the measurements that we made, but it
Gotcha.
has more components. I don't think there were any differences in terms of, in fact, they were made on the same production line, so it's just a question of more components and the costs associated with having two SKUs. So here's an interesting thing. We often hear that experienced trained listeners are more immune to biases, and this is what I was told. To the point where they said we don't need to do our test blind. But if you look at the delta between blind versus sighted for experienced listeners, there's a much greater difference in the sighted test. The scores went way up, and much greater delta than the inexperienced listeners. So we know from doing lots of these tests where we compare trained and untrained people that untrained people tend to use higher ratings overall, but they tend to score things in similar rank order. But it's unusual to see a trained listener use such high scores, and clearly seeing the products gives them a lot more confidence in their ratings, and that they're not they're suddenly unleashed from using these carefully judicious choice of numbers. And interesting, today I was reading studies, psychology of wine tasting, and apparently expert wine tasters are more they did the study where they took different white wines, and some of them they added a tasteless red dye to it. So even though it was the same white wine, it had this red dye. So, and that influenced the expert tasters more than the naive consumers, because they associated the importance of the color to certain characteristics of the wine, but they were obviously fooled to the point where they weren't really paying attention to the flavors and the taste. They were just they were preconditioned to look for things that based on the color.
So what you're saying is critics tend to delude themselves.
I mean, I think so. Critics have a lot of knowledge in interactions, and
Great comment here. Every reviewer should be aware of this.
Yeah. So yeah, experts perhaps are more biased than non-experts.
That actually surprises me, because I always thought that the trained listener, that's the whole reason why you trained. Is there a difference between a trained listener and an experienced listener that you're talking about here? Or is that this one and the same?
Yeah, I can't remember what we I have to read the paper, but somewhere in the paper we characterized what that was, and I think it wasn't necessary because this was early on. I'd only been there a year, so I don't know if we didn't have that software at that point. So it's probably they just participated in a lot of tests. Maybe they were speaker engineers, so on.
Well, maybe that explains things better. Maybe their hearing wasn't so good.
Well, yeah, we did have some JBL Pro guys in the test. The other thing we found that was, when we moved the speakers in different locations, the scores would go up and down.
Well, that makes sense.
More in the blind test, though, than in the sighted test. And we think that when you can actually see it's the same speaker, even though you've changed its location, you're not as sensitive to these room speaker interactions. And you see it particularly on the teal. You see a bigger delta with the G and the D. In the case of the sighted test, it looks like sound effects was more impacted by location.
I wonder if that has something to do with the linearity of the speaker, and especially how it's playing bass in the room. Because if the speaker's got like some weird port resonance or whatever, and you're placing it closer to a boundary, it's exacerbating that problem, and that's why the score changed more than a speaker that had a better linear flat frequency response.
Well, I think it's definitely got something to do with bass and how the speaker couples into the room modes. And in this case, I think the inside position 2 always produce better results in terms of bass, with the exception of the teal. And it did better in an outside position. And I think it might have something to do with it having a bit more bass or bass resonance that was tamed when you put it in the outside position.
Mm.
So it's just a different way of graphing what we just saw, but it shows, I think in the blind test, the positional effects were much larger. The changes were much larger than in the sighted test.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, we know that these are different music programs that were used in the test. And when the tests were blind, you see more program speaker interactions. SS is Stars and Stripes. I think it's the Boston Symphony Orchestra with John Williams. And when that program was played, it generally produced lower scores. But you could pretty well play any track in the sighted test and the scores would just not change. So once people can
What's the
see
sample size of this data?
So I showed it at the beginning. I think it was 30 or 40 subjects, 20 to 40 subjects.
And do you find you get the same results with the consistency of the sighted test and other studies that you guys have done?
Well, we haven't done many sighted studies, so that's
why you kind of abandoned it and went to blind.
Yeah. I mean, after we did this test. We didn't do many sighted tests ever after. I mean, we still do sighted listening when we're doing product development and we're doing quick checks, and it's certainly. But when you want to ultimately find out how you rate against the competitors, we do them blind.
Mm-hmm.
So sorry. So here's the measurements of those products, and this was before we had a full capability to do spinoramas and calculate. This was done with Melissa.
Damn, that little JBL system, sub-satellite system, integrated that well.
Well, this is measured without the subwoofer, so this is just the satellite.
Oh, okay, yeah, it goes to 100 hertz. Okay.
Yeah, and I've basically blocked out everything below 100 hertz because the measurements aren't accurate below there. So
you can see that first order crossover anomalies with the teal.
Yeah,
with the off-axis response.
Yeah.
So the German version is the one that had the higher crossover part count. You were saying, right?
Yeah.
It definitely measures better.
It does measure better. The sound power looks a little smoother. Well, it's a little, the on-axis looks a little better. It doesn't roll off as quickly.
Yeah.
But it was not enough to really
make a big difference.
Make a big difference in the test.
I mean, I guess that goes to the idea that there's probably always going to be some resonance in a speaker, and there's a certain point where maybe you've fixed it enough that it just doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah. So that's the key is knowing the audibility of those things and worrying about the ones that are audible and not spending money or time getting rid of something that's like a high Q thing that's not as audible.
I don't know. As someone that likes rare things, I would want that speaker though, just because I know there wasn't many made and it measures a little bit better. I would pay the extra for that.
Well, we'll have to come out with a Gene Delasala version.
There you go. Awesome.
And we'll charge you double.
I want to see the vertical directivity on that speaker with the two mid ranges like that.
Yeah. Unfortunately, these measurements are embarrassing to show. They're 28, almost 30 years ago. But we've modernized our measurement system, but this was the sort of the state of the art back then. One of the first controlled tests, and when I arrived, people were measuring speakers on chart recorders using B&K chart recorders.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And,
didn't they have LMS back then? I mean,
Well, the thing was, every engineer was using a different device to test their speakers. There was no consistency. They were doing listening differently. They were
Wow.
measuring differently. So we used to, when Floyd and I worked at NRC, we would get JBL products delivered, and we would test them, and they were like all over the map.
Hmm.
And some of them would be great. Some of them you wouldn't think they were made from the same company. And then when we got there, we understood why, because there was no consistent philosophy in how to measure or evaluate or even what the targets were. It was the Wild West.
Yeah, it just goes to show you if people like vintage speakers from 30 or 40 years ago, there was not a whole lot of science going on with those speakers. It was hard to measure them. It was hard to analyze. And transducer technology has evolved so much since then. So vintage speakers are like vintage cars. They just don't perform like today's, products.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a romantic notion that there's a lot of nostalgia involved.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this is an important point. I think in blind tests, more listeners were actually more sensitive to real effects of program and position, and experienced listeners were much higher than inexperienced listeners in the sighted test. So I often hear that blind tests are not as sensitive, or you can't hear things. And my experience is quite the opposite, that when we're relieved of all these human biases and we can just focus on the sound, our sensitivity and discrimination goes way up.
Which is funny, because there's, the cable guys they won't even allow entertain the discussion of a double blind test. It's always no blind test when it comes to cables.
Yeah, well, that in itself is suspicious. I mean, it tells me they're scared.
So before we go forward, I'm kind of curious if people that are watching this now, how can they conduct better listening tests on their own? If they buy 2 different speakers and they have 60 days to return it and they have it in their house, maybe we could do a separate video on this, Sean. Maybe we could come up with a decent way for someone to evaluate 2 different speakers. Maybe have someone set up a blind area where you can't see it, and just how to properly set them up and how to do the level matching and all that stuff, so you can make a more intelligent decision when you're buying product.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a whole separate topic, but it is possible. You don't need a $1 million lab to do these tests. You can get 90% of the way there by doing some basic controls and putting some cloth over the speakers and level matching them, and having someone administer the test and randomizing the positions, and
good separate topic.
Yep.
Yeah, I've seen events done that way where folks have put together blind tests and seem to have done a pretty good job for essentially just a DIY testing setup. I mean, you can get acoustically transparent screens and frames and things like that you could use to put in front of it, or speaker grill cloth or something, and it's not all that hard to put it together. Just a lot of effort. Yeah,
it is a lot of effort.
Yeah.
Art of German voicing and audio products has been forever lost.
Why?
Yeah.
So,
unfortunately, the German engineer lost his job, and the German speaker was discontinued. So
darn.
You got somebody fired over this.
Yeah, I'm not proud of that, but I mean, but I was more concerned about whether I was going to get fired. So.
Survival of the fittest.
In his defense, aesthetically, that response did look better, but apparently it didn't matter.
Yeah, you can't argue it looked better. The question is, do Germans appreciate better sound than the rest of Europe? I don't know. Why not just turn the Danish speaker into the German one, since people can't tell the difference, and call it a day?
Yeah.
Maybe fire the Danish designer. I think they fired the German one because he probably made a stronger case that Germans have better tastes, and that he has captured what that is, and
so someone's asking, was that a double blind test, the one you're referring to with the JBL?
Certainly the first test was double blind. The
Right.
subjects weren't aware, and I'm trying to remember how we did the switching. There was probably an employee that was controlling the switcher, so that part of it wasn't. I mean, they never knew what was A, B, or C. The switcher would randomly assign the letters, but it was controlled by a third person. The switching was.
Gotcha.
And position was a cue. I mean, you would sit there and evaluate 4 programs, and the speakers never moved. But then you would go out of the room and we'd swap them again. So at least we were controlling for positional effects.
Right.
So just I don't know if you want to go over this, but there's lots of examples of visual biases. The color of trains was affected the perception of how fast they were going. There's a study done by Fastel in Germany. And Gustafino, she's a researcher at McGill, found that the presence of a subwoofer, whether it was turned on or off, would affect the perception of low frequency. I had a funny story years ago. Harman was responsible for setting up a 5 or 7.1 playback system at an AES show, and these music producers and engineers would come in, and a lot of them back then didn't like subwoofers. They wanted 4-range speakers, and we'd set up bass management, and one of the engineers insisted that we turn it off, and I said I went over and I never did anything. I just left it on, and after he played the music, he said, "Thank you, that sounded much better." So.
That's funny. So just to be clear, when you did these blind tests, the upstream equipment, I'm assuming you used a competent amplifier that didn't swing its response based on the impedance of the speaker, right? Did you have a control amplifier that you knew had good output?
Yeah,
devices?
That's something we always check.
It's probably a Western Electric tube amp, single-ended.
Actually, I think I saw a picture of a double blind you did a couple of years ago, and you were using like a Mac Daddy $10,000 Mark Levinson amplifier, like the top of the line Levinson amplifier in the test.
Yeah, I mean, we're currently using 536s, which is what I have behind me. I think they're the mono block version, so we have 4 of those, one for each speaker. So I think they're 400 watts into 8 ohms and 800 watts into 4 ohms. So yeah, we have lots of. We can pretty well throw anything at our amps, and they're not going to hiccup. So I was talking about this the other day on Facebook, and yeah, so apparently Wharfdale in 1988, it's reported in Stereophile. I can't find it, but Don Keel talked about it at an Alma show, and apparently Wharfdale took 4 identical speakers, and the only thing they changed was the color of the grill cloth, and they had 30 people evaluate the speakers, and they found the color of the grill cloth affected their judgment of the sound, and the red ones had better bass, blue better clarity, yellow louder, green had the best spectral balance. So there you go.
So definitely then we should be doing green grill cloth in all of our speakers, apparently.
Yeah, and JBL, the L100 is orange, which is a combination of.
What is it about with that orange grill? I just have to ask.
I think it's cool.
No.
I would put that in my room.
Yeah. I don't own a pair of these, but
they're good speakers. I just can't stand the grill, to be honest with you.
I was really surprised by the sound when I heard them. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they got
not
great
expect a lot of them.
Yeah.
Didn't James review those, or he reviewed the L82 or L80?
I don't remember. I mean, he and I listened to him at a show. We were both pretty impressed by him.
Right.
It was cited, so we were probably biased.
Visual appearance of loudspeaker.
So I just added this last minute, so there's missing information, but this was a paper It's in the AES journal, and it was done by a guy at Aalborg University over in Denmark, and he was obviously sponsored by Bang & Olufsen. But he basically took these 5 loudspeakers and he showed them to pictures of them to people, and he said, based on these speakers, how would you rate their sound? And they widely varied. Just without hearing them, they had an opinion of how they sound. And I'm pretty sure the big expensive ones were rated high and the little tiny ones were rated low.
They
so then
sound
he
good
designed,
just looking at them.
Yeah. I mean, I think that one on the left doesn't look like it sounds very good.
No.
That looks like your surround channel in your old house, Matt. Your back channel.
Leave my back channels alone.
It looks
Sorry,
like
Sean.
it looks like a JBL Flip. I mean, in terms of size, without a stand. But so then he had them. So he already knew that they had an opinion of them based on how they look. He then did a test where he set them up in stereo pairs, and they did a test. So they could see the products, and he would switch between them. And in the center, behind the curtain, he had a hidden speaker. I think it was a Genelec. And what they were really hearing all the time was a single speaker that was being processed with distortion or a high-pass filter where they're removing different amounts of bass. And they did the tests where they can see the speakers, and they did the tests where they can't see them. There's a screen, and he found out that the scores didn't change whether they could see them or not.
Wow, and you don't think they could localize that the speaker in the center was the one playing?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. Apparently, he tried to explain to them that he would flash a spotlight on them when they were visual, so it appeared that they were,
Sounds like an interrogation.
Well, they were spotlights on the speakers, not the listeners.
Oh, okay.
But they were trying.
That'd be uncomfortable.
This one's playing now.
So he did his best to try to convince people and trick them that they were actually listening to the speakers, but nonetheless, it appears that the visual factors had very little effect. So, and what does this mean? I don't know that it means that you shouldn't do your test blind, but
yeah, it kind of goes against the sighted versus blind argument.
It does, and that's why I threw it out, because I want to sort of present other evidence that's contrary to what we tend to believe.
So the only thing I have over, reading all this research over the years, and I've talked to Matt about this, I know you guys say that usually a mono test will win in stereo as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's more value to the spatiality of having a stereo pair of speakers playing in a room. And I don't think you get that resolution with a single mono speaker. Do you have any thoughts or experiments that you guys have done on that? Because one thing I noticed, there was a particular speaker that you guys scored low in a blind test, but it seemed like it got a little bit better in a sighted test, proportionally more than the other speakers. And that speaker lends itself to doing better as a stereo pair just because of the way it performs in a room. And I was kind of curious about, have you guys looked at the spatial aspects, not just amplitude response differences?
So we have done tests from time to time where we did them in mono and then we did them in stereo, and we don't do them a lot, but when we have done them, we get very similar results. And when a speaker is in well designed in mono, it sort of disappears. It sounds spacious. It's not like a focused beam where you can hear part of the frequency response, and that seems to translate well when you go to stereo. The imaging is very, very wide. If it has wide dispersion, it's hard. It sort of disappears. If it's very directional and focused, it tends to be more localizable. Some people like that capability or that characteristic, others don't. And then, I mentioned earlier we did a test where we did it in mono, stereo, and 5.1, and the differences, In this case, there was no, what was it? There was no evidence that, the bad speaker improved when you went to, I know Floyd has, in his early papers, showed an example of that. I think it was a quad. It was an electrostatic dipole that did better in stereo than mono. But you mentioned another example, which maybe you can jog my memory because I'm not.
It was one of the Martin Logans. It's basically an
It's
electrostat.
Yeah.
Same kind of concept.
I think that those speakers have long been famous for their imaging, for people who like those, which is they're very narrow directivity. I mean, if you look at they have almost no sidewall reflections at all, which tends to give you that like, I think you called it once, laser-like imaging. I mean, everything is very, very focused and precise. Some people hate that. Some people absolutely love it. It's a distinct sound. And I would guess that it would be much easier to tell. And I would think you would like that more in stereo than you would in mono.
Yeah, I can't try to remember if we ever did that. I think we have done that comparison. But since you mentioned the mono, the Martin Logan, here's a large test with the Martin Logan, and this happens to be in mono. And it was rated last by, on average in every group we tested, including reviewers. The reviewers had trouble discriminating between the other top speakers, but regardless of who we brought in, they always said it was rated fourth. And this is graph's been shown. This is a graph showing listener performance based on how discriminating and consistent people are. Mm-hmm. And but anyways, so what here's the case where we have three highly rated speakers, P, B, and M, all highly rated Speaker of the Year awards, and yet when you do the tests blind, the speakers with technically inferior measurements receive much lower ratings. So I think here's a case of why you need to do a blind test.
So they must have been very pretty speakers, right?
Well, yeah, these are all, M is like $11,000. P was the Infinity Prelude, $10,000. Bowers and Wilkins 802, Nautilus 8,000 or 8,500. So yeah, these are all $5,000 to $11,000 speakers. And if you look at the measurements on the right, I mean, the Martin Logan is very colored, and I have trouble believing that there's something about this speaker in stereo that suddenly all these colorations and resonances are just, oh wow, those don't matter. I can hear very narrow, tight imaging. I don't see the colorations being outweighed by the spatial representation. And this speaker also has a very tight, narrow sweet spot. You can see as you go from on axis to off axis, the high frequencies just die. So, this is a speaker where, depending on where you sit in the room, you get a different result, because sitting on axis is very bright and nasal. You move off axis is very dull. So when we have single listener tests, we get much more consistent ratings. When you bring in a group of people, the ratings will be quite variable depending on where they're sitting compared to these other speakers.
Now, do you think it's possible that it was a bad sample, or did you have multiple samples that you measured and saw the same pattern when you measured them?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I think we've tested more than one. We've also bought some of the I think it's called the Prodigy, or what's this one called? The Martin Logan Prodigy. Well, it's not on the slide.
Yeah.
But this is the 10.
You tested more than one, right?
Yeah, we bought the $4,000 version of this, and it's very similar in terms of the measurements.
Yeah.
So I don't know. People have said, "Well, you put it in the wrong position. You didn't." I've heard every excuse, but when you look at the Spinorama, it doesn't matter where you sit, what room you're in. You're always going to hear these colorations.
Wow, that
Yes,
other
it
one.
measures. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Matt. Go ahead. You go.
I was going to say it measures like I expect it would. I mean, just if you think about how this thing reproduces sound, it looks like it has. Yeah, well, and it's a large diaphragm that's reproducing sound across its whole entire surface, so it's going to cause a lot of comb filtering, and that's what you see. The dipole is going to cause a lot of cancellations behind it. It's a two-way, right? Basically, it's got like a powered sub in the base.
Yeah, it's got a powered sub.
Doesn't look like it's integrated very well.
No.
It's about what I'd expect.
I mean, we've not found many people who like this in a blind test.
Right.
So I'm just at odds how it could be Speaker of the Year.
Is that top speaker the Prelude MTS?
Yeah, that was the.
Why did
That was a really good speaker.
Why did you discontinue that speaker?
Yeah,
Not you, Harman.
Yeah, I don't know. It was
It's
probably
a good speaker.
Probably not a big money maker, and it had a lot of drivers and parts to it. And
It had the first room correction system, I think, out of any speaker on the market. What was it called? Arcos or something?
No, it's called Rabos.
Rabos,
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I salivated for that speaker as a teenager in high school when I saw those come out.
So I ended up buying the next one down, which is the Intermezzo 4.1 tower. And that's the one that it's kind of funky looking. It looks like a double bass, and it's got the same 15-inch powered subwoofer. And it measures almost as good as the Prelude, and it's half the price.
Matt, Don Dunn says you're boring. Step it up, man.
This isn't my talk.
Hey, well, let's not be boring.
I guess I needed to get, I don't know, some brandy and chocolate or something.
Yeah, so that's what I want to know, Sean. Besides wine, what other vices do you have? Because, Gramani and I are huge dark chocolate fans. Are you into chocolate as well? And do you do blind taste tests of chocolate?
No, I'm not. Unfortunately, I mean, I like chocolate, but I'm like diabetic, so I have to avoid sweet things and high carbs.
Man. I was going to send you an Audioholics chocolate bar with our logo on it for Christmas. Now I have to try to get you one that's sugar-free.
Yeah. Luckily, my girlfriend hates chocolate, so I'm never tempted when I go over there. But yeah, I obviously like wine, and I like coffee a lot. Coffee and wine, I guess, are my two.
Huge coffee fan myself.
Vices. Yeah. I can't function without coffee.
Me too.
So our next talk should be on coffee, I think.
Yeah.
I have a small collection over here I can bring over.
Matt's actually really knowledgeable. I brought up coffee one day and I got an hour lecture from him. I was like, damn, I didn't know all this about coffee.
Well, I do like my coffee, and I do tend to over-research
You made me realize I prefer dark roasts.
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, I do too. But
it's got lower acid in it.
So how do you make your coffee? What kind of do you brew it or drip?
Yeah. I have a pour over.
Yeah.
I got one of those machines, the cappuccino machines.
Yeah,
with pressure.
I bought one of these Jura Swiss machines, one of these heavy duty, fully automated dual beam things, and it'll do any kind of coffee you want.
Sweet.
Spent a lot of money on it, but it's lasted for 7 years. I've not had a single issue with it.
It makes you happy.
It's worth the effort to grind your own beans, because I have the Nespresso where you get the little capsules. Those are pretty good, but they're bitter. They're not like when you grind your own coffee and run it through.
Yeah, I had an Nespresso machine for a while, and it just became too expensive for the capsules and not environmentally good. And then I had a what's the other one where you put in the cups?
Keurig.
Keurig, yeah. I've gone through all the phases. And,
I've tried all those. I never liked the coffee all that much in any of the.
No.
Yeah, I didn't like the Keurig.
I like the freedom of being able to choose your own beans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love how we always talk. The conversation on audio always winds up going back to food or some type of a drink that you can take that'll either make you drunk or give you energy.
There you go.
Well, coffee is energy, and wine is
The opposite.
Could be drunk. Yes.
Yeah. Well, Sean, that was a great convo on the double-blind tests and the fallacy or the biases of sighted tests. I think it gives a lot of people to think about. Next, maybe in a couple of times later, we could do a YouTube just on how to make a better sighted or blind test for people at home. So when they're buying different speakers, they could better evaluate, because a lot of people don't even realize they need the level match. And if they get the Clip speaker that has a higher sensitivity than the ELAC, they're going to gravitate towards a louder speaker if they don't, level match them. So I think that's a great topic to explore in a future video.
I think Klipsch is counting on that. I mean,
for sure. Yeah.
When you go in the store, it just jumps out at you.
Yep. That's the speaker that you could always identify in a blind test.
Yeah.
Klipsch. Yeah. You could definitely tell you're listening to a Klipsch, especially if you don't level match. So the next topic I'd like to talk about, this is kind of a pandemic on YouTube of YouTubers basically doing binaural listening tests, saying you can listen to speaker A versus speaker B. And I'm not picking on anybody per se. I'm just saying there's limitations, big limitations to these tests. I think they're fun. I think it's cool when people do them. But when you say these can substitute real listening tests of being in a room with speakers, I think that becomes dangerous if people make conclusions based on that. So I'd love to maybe have you do a lecture on the challenges, because you guys have done a lot of research on binaural, and it's not so trivial. It's not just sticking a binaural mic in a room, measuring a speaker, putting on a pair of headphones on YouTube and listening to speaker A versus speaker B.
Yeah.
Right? It's not that easy.
Yeah. I mean, we've had to use these methods usually when there was no alternative. It's not like our first choice, back in NRC, we did them where we would compare different speakers in different rooms to study how we adapt, because when you do them in situ, you have time to adapt, but when you actually switch from room to room, you have no time to adapt, and we found that was a huge effect.
So that it would be cool if we could construct like a test online where people can listen with a binaural recording with their headphones. They could figure out what speaker they like best, and then you can compare the data with your blind tests and the measurements, and we'll see how they correlate.
Yeah.
I'm giving you a lot of work.
Yeah, you're throwing this at me live, so
you're committed.
All these people now are expecting this. And
yeah. What do you guys think? Give me comments down below. Do you guys want to do a binaural listening test of 3 different speakers that Harman has measured and done their own controlled listening tests, and see how you rank the speakers compared to control? So we'll see comments when this video is published. Oh, there you go. You got a yes right here. Sean, you're committed, man.
Okay.
Well, Sean, I appreciate you taking the time here to drop some knowledge on us. Guys, if you want this information, if you want to look over the slides, here we go. We got more yeses. Go to our Patreon channel at patreon.com/audioholics. Matt, I also appreciate you adding to the discussion as well. I feel really privileged to have you guys contribute to the Audioholics cause. And, we're constantly trying to elevate the content and put the truth in science in audio, because it's so lacking in our industry. And, this is invaluable when you guys take the time to do this. And I really appreciate it. Bottom of the heart right here.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Well, that is it. And until next time, my friends, keep listening.